Hey guys, tonight we're talking about what it was like to fight in a Roman Testudo formation. Here's something that'll make your stomach turn. A Roman legionary in the Testudo's front rank had a life expectancy of about 14 minutes once combat began. 14 minutes. That's less time than it takes to watch a sitcom episode. But here's the twisted part. Men volunteered for that position. They fought each other for the honour of standing where death was nearly guaranteed. Why? Because the front rank got double pay and first choice of plunder. Rome built an empire by convincing poor men that dying in a shield wall was upward mobility. The legions didn't conquer the world through superior weapons or divine favour. They won because they perfected a system that turned terrified farm boys into components of a killing machine so efficient that Germanic tribes called it the Iron Beast that cannot die. Dear viewers, our big goal is to reach 1,000 subscribers on this channel, and with your support we can achieve it. Only on our channel will you find such interesting and unique stories about wars. Subscribe so you don't miss them. We're sincerely grateful to everyone who helps us achieve this goal. Also, write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious to see people from all over the world brought together by a single story. And now, let's move on to today's story. Marcus Flavius was 19 years old. He'd never seen a book. He'd never questioned whether Rome had the right to rule the world. He knew the gods watched every action the way he knew winter followed autumn. His village outside Aquileia existed in a permanent state of near starvation, where 3 bad harvests meant children stopped being born because wombs couldn't sustain life. Marcus's father had returned from the Germanic campaigns with 3 fingers missing on his left hand, a pension that bought exactly nothing, and stories that made Marcus wake screaming until he turned 12. The old man would drink cheap wine and describe how a chatty warrior's axe had come down on his shield hand, how he'd watched his fingers tumble into the mud still twitching, how the formation had kept moving forward while he bled and screamed and tried to pick up his own severed digits with his remaining hand. The recruitment officer arrived in spring of 168 AD, wearing parade armour polished to a mirror shine. Marcus joined the line of desperate men stretching outside the village temple. 90% wouldn't pass the physical examination. Height requirements alone eliminated most. You needed to stand at least 5 feet 8 inches, enormous by the standards of chronically malnourished provincials. Marcus cleared the height stick by half an inch. The officer checked his teeth like he was buying a horse, looked for hernias and flat feet, made him run 50 yards to check for limps. 23 men volunteered that day. 7 were accepted. 1 would desert during training. 1 would die of disease before seeing combat. The rest would learn what it meant to stop being human and become part of something that killed with mathematical precision. The march to the training camp near Carnuntum took 11 days. Marcus carried nothing but a sack with spare clothes, and the small bronze figurine of Mars his mother had pressed into his hands while weeping. She knew the statistics even if she couldn't articulate them. 1 in 3 legionaries died during their first enlistment. The recruiters marched them 12 hours daily, allowed minimal rest, and beat anyone who complained. This wasn't cruelty. This was curriculum. A legionary needed to march 20 Roman miles in 5 hours while carrying 90 pounds of equipment, build a fortified camp in 2 hours, then stand guard shifts through the night. Men who couldn't handle a light march with no gear would die and kill their comrades in the process. Carnuntum sprawled across the Danube frontier like a permanent wound in the landscape. 40,000 soldiers cycled through its training facilities, creating a city that existed solely to transform civilians into weapons. Marcus arrived covered in road dust, feet bleeding through his sandals, understanding nothing of what awaited him. The camp stretched beyond visual range. Hundreds of barracks, training grounds, armories, workshops, and the eternal sound of men screaming. Not from pain, though there was plenty of that, from exertion, from centurions bellowing orders, from the constant roar of organised violence being rehearsed and perfected. They shaved his head that first day, removed every hair from his body with bronze razors that scraped skin bloody. This served two purposes: preventing lice and eliminating individuality. Marcus stopped being a person with a specific appearance and became interchangeable with every other recruit. The uniform completed the transformation: a red tunic that marked him as property of the legions, military sandals with hobnails that would carry him thousands of miles, and a wooden training sword that weighed exactly twice what the iron gladius did. The extra weight wasn't accidental. Recruits trained with deliberately punishing equipment so that real combat gear would feel light by comparison. His first centurion was named Quintus Balbus, a man with a face like weathered leather and eyes that had watched men die in every conceivable way. Balbus had survived 23 years of service, which meant he was either extraordinarily lucky, extraordinarily skilled, or, most likely, completely insane in whatever specific way allowed a person to function in continuous violence. He addressed the new recruits while walking along their formation, vine staff in hand, looking for any excuse to use it. The vine staff was every centurion's badge of office and preferred disciplinary tool, hard enough to break bones, light enough to swing all day without tiring. Training began before dawn and continued until full darkness made it impossible to see. The first week focused entirely on marching, not walking, marching, synchronized movement where hundreds of men stepped with the same foot simultaneously, turned in perfect unison, halted as one organism. Recruits who couldn't maintain pace received immediate correction via the vine staff. Marcus learned that the staff didn't just hurt, it broke things. A recruit named Tiberius took a blow to the ribs that snapped 3 of them. He continued marching because falling out of formation meant worse punishment. The message was explicit: your body's integrity matters less than the formation's integrity. The wooden practice sword became Marcus's constant companion. They drilled with it 6 hours daily against wooden posts driven into the ground. The technique was brutally simple: thrust from behind your shield, withdraw, thrust again. No wild slashing, no heroic overhead strikes, just repetitive stabbing motion designed to punch through leather armor and into vital organs. The training sword's extra weight meant Marcus's arm muscles burned with lactic acid after the first hour. After the second hour, he couldn't feel his fingers. After the 4th hour, he learned to ignore his body's screaming protests and continue the mechanical thrust-withdraw rhythm until ordered to stop. Men vomited from exertion. Several passed out and were left where they fell until evening, when they either woke up or were carried to the medical tent. Week 2 introduced the scutum, the massive rectangular shield that defined Roman infantry. Each shield stood 4 feet tall, 2.5 feet wide, curved to wrap around the soldier's body, and weighed 22 pounds of laminated wood covered in leather and canvas. The centre featured an iron boss, a hemispherical projection that could be used as a weapon itself, smashing into faces and breaking noses. Marcus received his training shield and immediately understood this wasn't just defensive equipment. This was part of your body now. You didn't carry it. It carried you. The shield's curve meant properly held. It protected from shoulder to shin while leaving your right arm free for the sword. But the real lesson of the scutum came when they learned to lock shields. This was the foundation of everything. Individual shields overlapping to create an impenetrable wall. The recruit on your left overlapped your shield by exactly 4 inches. You overlapped the man on your right by the same measure. Too little overlap and spear points could penetrate the gaps. Too much, and the formation became rigid, unable to advance or respond to threats. Centurions walked behind the formation with measuring sticks, beating anyone whose overlap was incorrect. The precision wasn't arbitrary, it was the difference between a functional shield wall and a death trap. The Testudo itself, the tortoise formation, required even more complex coordination. Front rank held shields vertical, creating a wall. Side ranks angled shields outward at 45 degrees, protecting flanks. Rear ranks raised shields overhead like roof tiles, each one overlapping the next to create a complete shell. When properly executed, the Testudo became a mobile fortress impervious to arrows, javelins, and most hand weapons. When improperly executed, it became a clustered mass of panicking men who died within seconds. They practiced the formation 8 hours daily. Lock shields, advance 10 paces, halt, tighten formation, advance again. The repetition was mind-numbing, deliberately so. You needed to be able to form Testudo while exhausted, terrified, and watching your friends die. A recruit named Gaius collapsed during formation drill in the 3rd week. Heat exhaustion, probably combined with dehydration and the accumulated stress of chronic sleep deprivation. He fell forward into the man in front of him, which broke the shield wall's integrity. The centurion's response was immediate and instructive. He ordered the formation to continue advancing. They marched directly over Gaius's body. Marcus felt the man's ribs break under his hobnailed sandals. The lesson was explicit. The formation matters more than any individual within it. Gaius recovered eventually after spending 2 weeks in the medical tent. He learned the same lesson everyone learned. You could be injured, sick, dying, but you maintained formation until ordered otherwise. Month 2 brought full armour. The Lorica segmentata was a masterpiece of military engineering. Overlapping iron plates held together with leather straps, providing excellent protection while remaining flexible enough for combat movement. Each set was custom fitted to the soldier, adjusted until it sat properly on shoulders and hips. The armour weighed 30 pounds. Combined with the shield, helmet, gladius, 2 pillar javelins, rations, water, and personal equipment, the total combat load reached 90 pounds. They marched 20 Roman miles, roughly 18 modern miles, carrying this weight in 5 hours. This wasn't an occasional test. This was the minimum acceptable standard. Legions needed to cover vast distances quickly, often racing to battlefields to catch enemy forces before they dispersed. The full-gear marches revealed which recruits would survive. Physical strength mattered less than mental endurance. Marcus watched men who looked stronger, taller, more athletic than him, break down psychologically under the relentless grinding pressure. The human body can adapt to almost any physical stress given time, but the mind breaks faster. Recruits would simply stop, shields dropping from nerveless fingers, standing vacant-eyed while centurions screamed at them. These men were discharged, sent back to their villages with nothing, no pension, no honour, just the knowledge they weren't capable of what Rome required. The Testudo drills intensified with full equipment. Now instructors threw actual projectiles at the formation, rocks, burning bundles of hay, even blunted javelins. The overhead shields had to deflect rather than catch. A shield angled wrong would catch a javelin, which would stick into the wood and add 15 pounds of dangling weight. Germanic tribes specialised in javelins designed specifically for this. Long iron shanks that bent on impact, making them impossible to throw back and too heavy to continue carrying. A Testudo with even 3 stuck javelins per soldier became immobile, vulnerable, dead. So they practiced the angle obsessively. 45 degrees, no more, no less, allowing projectiles to slide off rather than embed. Marcus's shoulders developed permanent bruises from the shield's weight. The scutum had a horizontal grip behind the central boss, which meant your arm was constantly tensed holding it in position. After hours of maintaining formation, the muscle cramping became indistinguishable from stabbing pains. Recruits developed thick calluses on their left shoulders, where the shield's upper rim rested. Some men's shoulders began bleeding from the constant friction, the raw flesh never healing because the shield resumed its position every morning. The Medici treated these injuries with vinegar and olive oil, which hurt worse than the original wounds, but prevented infection. The psychological conditioning was more subtle than the physical training, but equally important. Centurions told stories constantly, histories of past battles, descriptions of enemy tactics, cautionary tales about formations that broke. The Varian disaster featured prominently. In 9 AD, Publius Quinctilius Varus had led 3 entire legions, nearly 20,000 men, into the Teutoburg forest. Germanic tribes ambushed them in terrain where the Testudo couldn't function. The formations broke in the mud and confined forest paths. The Germans annihilated all 3 legions over 3 days of running combat. Varus committed suicide rather than face capture. Augustus Caesar supposedly spent the rest of his life randomly screaming, "Varus, give me back my legions." The lesson was clear. Discipline maintained means survival. Discipline broken means extinction. Marcus trained with his contubernium, his 8-man tent group. These men became the core unit of Roman military organization. 8 men shared a tent, shared equipment maintenance, shared cooking duties, and most importantly, shared survival in combat. The army deliberately cultivated bonds deeper than friendship. Lucius slept 3 feet from Marcus every night. They knew each other's nightmares, eating habits, fears, and the specific sounds each man made when waking. Cassius had a wife and daughter he wrote letters to weekly, letters he couldn't actually send because literacy was rare and mail service inconsistent. Decimus prayed to Mars every dawn, whispering the same formula, touching the same amulet. These rituals became communal knowledge, part of the tent group's shared identity. The tent group structure meant abandoning a comrade was abandoning family. When Lucius developed severe dysentery in month 4, Marcus and the others took turns staying awake through the night, ensuring he didn't aspirate vomit and die. They shared their rations even though everyone was perpetually hungry. They covered his duties during formation drills when he was too weak to stand properly. This wasn't altruism, it was survival strategy. In combat, these 7 other men represented the only barrier between Marcus and death. Their shields protected him, their discipline kept him alive, their presence made the unbearable bearable. Month 5 brought sparring against other recruits. Not friendly competition, actual combat with wooden weapons at full force. Broken bones were common, expected, considered part of the curriculum. Marcus took a training sword to the face that split his lip and loosened 2 teeth. He barely noticed. The constant low-level pain of training had recalibrated his entire relationship with physical suffering. What would have sent him screaming to a physician in civilian life now registered as minor discomfort. The body's ability to adapt to punishment was remarkable, the mind's ability to normalize violence even more so. The final week of training included the full simulation. 2 cohorts of recruits, nearly 1,000 men, formed opposing testudos and advanced toward each other. The centurions observed from elevated platforms, taking notes on which formations maintained integrity under pressure. The 2 shield walls collided with a sound like timber cracking. Marcus stood in the 3rd rank, crushed between bodies, shield pressed against the back of the man in front, feeling the massive pressure of the men behind pushing forward. The formation compressed until breathing became difficult. This was the reality of Testudo combat. Not individual heroism, but collective pressure. hundreds of men creating irresistible force through coordinated mass. The simulation revealed formation weaknesses immediately. A section of the opposing Testudo had incorrect shield overlap, 6 inches instead of 4. When the formations collided, that weak point buckled. Men stumbled, gaps appeared, and the entire section collapsed within seconds. Centurions blew whistles, ending the exercise, then spent an hour publicly humiliating the recruits responsible. The punishment for failure wasn't just embarrassment. Those recruits received decimation, 1 in 10, chosen by lot, beaten by their 9 comrades with vine staffs. The beating wasn't symbolic. 2 recruits required medical treatment afterward. 1 lost vision in his left eye. Marcus completed training in month 6. He'd arrived weighing 140 pounds. He now weighed 165, all muscle and scar tissue. His hands had transformed into calloused weapons that barely felt pain. His mind had been stripped of everything except tactical thinking, angles of approach, shield overlap measurements, the mathematical precision of formation warfare. He could march 25 miles carrying full gear and build a fortified camp afterward without conscious thought. He could thrust a gladius 200 times in succession without his arm trembling. He could lock shields with 7 other men and become part of an organism that moved and reacted as one. The graduation ceremony involved ritual purification and oath-taking. Marcus swore loyalty to Rome, to the emperor, to his legion and cohort and century. The oath wasn't metaphorical. Breaking it meant execution. He received his iron gladius, the real sword that weighed half what the training version did. The blade felt like an extension of his arm, perfectly balanced, 18 inches of pattern-welded steel sharp enough to shave with. He received his 2 pila, javelins with long iron shanks designed to penetrate shields. He received his real scutum, painted with his century's emblems, and he received his first posting, frontier duty along the Danube, where Germanic tribes were massing in unprecedented numbers. The veterans who'd completed their service offered final advice before Marcus's cohort departed. One old legionary with scars covering half his face pulled Marcus aside, spoke quietly enough that centurions couldn't hear. He said the Testudo worked perfectly until it didn't, that the moment of formation collapse was when good men died for nothing, that trusting the soldier beside you was mandatory but stupid because everyone broke eventually. He said the formation required absolute discipline, but absolute discipline required abandoning the survival instinct, creating a paradox that killed thinking men faster than arrows. Then he walked away, left Marcus with that poisoned knowledge he'd carry into his first battle. The legion marched north toward the Danube frontier at dawn. Marcus took his position in the column's 3rd rank, shield on his back, gladius at his side, ready to transform from individual into component of Rome's killing machine whenever the centurion's whistle signalled formation. The training was complete. The real test was beginning. The Testudo wasn't Roman invention. It was Roman perfection of principles borrowed from Greek phalanx warfare and refined through centuries of trial and catastrophic error. Every measurement, every angle, every tactical doctrine had been purchased with blood. The 4-inch shield overlap existed because during the Samnite Wars, overlaps of 3 inches had allowed enemy spears to penetrate, killing 17 men in a single engagement before the formation adjusted. The 45-degree angle for overhead shields came from battles against Gallic tribes who'd learned to throw javelins in high arcs, specifically to defeat earlier Testudo variants. Rome didn't innovate through genius, it iterated through corpses. Marcus learned the mathematical precision during advanced tactical training conducted while the legion marched north. Senior centurions walked alongside columns, explaining the geometry of survival. Each legionary occupied exactly 3 feet of lateral space in formation. closer and men couldn't use their weapons effectively. Wider and gaps appeared that enemy warriors could exploit. The depth of the formation mattered equally. 8 ranks was standard, providing enough mass to maintain pressure while allowing tired front rank fighters to rotate backward. Formations deeper than 8 ranks wasted men who couldn't effectively contribute. Shallower formations lacked the psychological weight that made Testudo advances so demoralizing to enemies. The shields themselves embodied decades of engineering refinement. The scutum's curve wasn't aesthetic. It was functional geometry that distributed impact force across the shield's entire surface, rather than concentrating it at the point of contact. A flat shield would splinter under repeated axe blows. The curved design redirected force laterally, making the shield stronger than the material suggested. The leather and canvas covering protected the wooden core from weather damage, but also provided friction that helped shields lock together. Untreated wood was too smooth. Shields would slip past each other under pressure. The canvas grip meant individual shields became a unified surface. The central iron boss served triple purpose. Offensively, it was a weapon. The Testudo could punch forward, using shield bosses as battering rams that broke noses, shattered jaws, and knocked enemies unconscious. Defensively, it reinforced the shield's weakest point where the hand grip created structural vulnerability. Psychologically, it created a visual focus that drew enemy attention to the shield's strongest section, away from the edges where proper overlap was critical. Germanic warriors would instinctively strike the boss, hitting where the shield could best absorb impact. Germanic tribes had adapted their tactics specifically to counter the Testudo. Their specialized javelins, framey, featured 7-foot iron shanks that bent on impact, exactly as Marcus had learned in training. But the tactical doctrine went deeper. Germans would throw waves of framey from maximum range, not trying to kill Romans but to weight down the Testudo until it became immobile. A formation carrying 200 bent javelins embedded in shields couldn't advance, couldn't maneuver, could only stand in place while Germanic infantry closed for hand-to-hand combat, where Roman discipline advantages diminished. The counter to this counter involved timing and courage. Testudo formations needed to advance through the javelin storm, shields angled to deflect rather than catch, accepting casualties to maintain mobility. Overhead, shield carriers bore the highest risk. Framey thrown in high arcs would punch through poorly angled shields and into the men beneath. The mathematics were brutal. Advance too slowly and accumulate too many embedded javelins. Advance too quickly and break formation cohesion. The optimal speed was 75 paces per minute under missile fire, a rate that felt impossibly slow when iron-tipped death rained from above. Marcus's sentry practiced this specific drill daily during the march north. Instructors with slings would hurl lead bullets, each weighing half a pound, at the overhead shields while the formation advanced. Men who angled shields incorrectly received immediate negative feedback when bullets punched through and struck them. Decimus took a lead bullet to the shoulder that shattered his collarbone. He was carried in a supply wagon for 3 weeks while the bone healed incorrectly, leaving his left arm permanently higher than his right. The deformity actually helped his shield work. The altered angle proved more efficient at deflecting high-arc projectiles. The full equipment march revealed why Romans conquered, while other armies merely fought. 90 pounds of gear became normal, expected, manageable. The lorica segmentata distributed weight across shoulders and hips through careful engineering, overlapping plates that flexed with body movement, while providing protection equivalent to solid armor weighing twice as much. The segmented design meant a spear thrust might penetrate one plate, but the overlapping layers would stop it from reaching flesh. Germanic warriors wore leather, occasionally chainmail if they could afford it. Roman legionaries wore armor designed by military engineers and tested across 3 continents. The gladius represented similar mathematical optimization. 18 inches of blade, double-edged, designed exclusively for thrusting. The length was specific, long enough to reach vital organs from behind a shield, short enough to withdraw quickly without catching on ribs or armor. The double edge meant the blade didn't need correct orientation. Any thrust could kill. The point was reinforced, capable of punching through leather and even thin chainmail. Spanish blacksmiths had perfected the pattern welding technique that made the blade flexible enough to bend 90 degrees without breaking, while remaining hard enough to hold an edge through sustained combat. But weapons and armour mattered less than the psychological transformation. Marcus was no longer an individual who happened to be standing near other individuals. He'd become a component of a machine, his thoughts synchronized with the 7 other men in his contubernium and the 79 others in his century. When Lucius's shield wavered during formation drill, Marcus felt it through his own shield before he saw it. The physical connection created neurological synchronization. They breathed together, shifted weight together, anticipated movements together. This wasn't metaphor or training propaganda. Brain chemistry actually changed. The isolation and terror of solo combat transformed into collective experience, where fear was diluted across 80 men. The night camps demonstrated this psychological architecture at scale. Every evening, the Legion constructed a complete fortified base covering over 50 acres. 6,000 men dug ditches, raised earthen ramparts, installed wooden palisades, and established guard towers in under 2 hours. The construction followed identical pattern regardless of terrain. Rectangular layout, 4 gates at cardinal points, internal roads in grid pattern, command tent at precise center. A legionary could wake in complete darkness, disoriented and half asleep, and navigate the camp through pure muscle memory, because every camp was functionally identical. The fortifications weren't symbolic. Germanic tribes specialized in night raids, believing darkness gave them tactical advantage over civilized Romans who needed light to function. They were catastrophically wrong. The camps created killing zones, open ground between palisade and ditch, where attackers would be silhouetted against the sky, while defenders fought from elevated positions. Guard towers provided overlapping fields of observation. The gates could be sealed and defended by small numbers. The system had been refined through hundreds of night battles, each one adding minor improvements purchased with Roman blood. Marcus stood guard duty on the 3rd week of March, positioned atop the eastern gate tower during the midnight to dawn shift. The darkness was absolute, cloud cover obscuring stars, moon not yet risen, forest pressing close enough to feel their presence. The Optio had warned them that Germanic scouts shadowed the column constantly, watching for vulnerabilities, reporting back to tribal chiefs who were gathering forces ahead. The psychological warfare had already begun. 2 nights earlier, drums had echoed from the forests, deep bass rhythms that suggested forces much larger than intelligence indicated. The drumming continued for 3 hours, designed to prevent sleep and fray nerves. The forest seemed to breathe. Wind moving through trees created sounds indistinguishable from human movement. Marcus's eyes invented shapes in the darkness, phantom warriors that disappeared when he focused on them. The legionary beside him, a veteran named Vorenus with 12 years of service, had learned to ignore his senses entirely, trusting instead the sophisticated early warning systems Romans had developed. Bells hung from the palisade on thin threads, would jingle if anyone touched the defences. Geese, notoriously territorial birds impossible to sneak past, wandered the perimeter. The Romans had used geese as sentries since they'd saved the capital from Gallic raiders 4 centuries earlier. Vorenus explained the deeper psychological dynamics while scanning darkness. Germanic warriors believed Romans were soft, civilized creatures who couldn't function without their comfortable cities and paved roads. This misunderstanding was tactically useful. Germans would attack in ways that assumed Roman weakness: night raids, ambushes in difficult terrain, individual challenges to single combat. These tactics played directly into Roman strengths. The legion didn't need light because the fortifications created controlled environments. Difficult terrain was why they carried tools and built roads. Individual combat was exactly what Romans avoided, substituting collective discipline for personal heroism. The march continued through increasingly hostile territory. They passed burned villages, Roman settlements that had been sacked when Germanic tribes crossed the frozen Danube in unprecedented winter raids. The destruction followed patterns that suggested military planning rather than random violence. Wells were poisoned with animal corpses, granaries were burned, roads were deliberately damaged at strategic points. This wasn't tribal warriors randomly pillaging. This was coordinated campaign designed to make Roman frontier positions unsustainable. The worst discovery came on day 19. A Roman patrol, 6 mounted scouts, had been captured and crucified along the main road where the legion couldn't avoid seeing them. But the Germans hadn't simply killed them. They'd been skinned alive with sufficient medical knowledge to keep them conscious through the process. The skin had been stretched on wooden frames beside each cross, still recognizable as human, displaying the level of suffering inflicted. 2 of the crucified men were still alive when the legion arrived. They begged for death through lipless mouths. The centurion showed no emotion. They ordered the survivors mercy killed with quick gladius thrusts to the heart, arranged for proper cremation, and continued the march within an hour. But the psychological message had been received by every legionary. The Germans wanted Romans to fear capture more than death. This was sophisticated psychological warfare designed to make men fight more desperately, exhaust themselves, make mistakes born of terror rather than training. The proper counter was demonstrating absolute indifference, refusing to acknowledge the intimidation attempt, maintaining discipline regardless of what horrors awaited. That night 2 recruits deserted. They slipped away during the evening watch change, probably planning to disappear into the forests and somehow make their way back to civilization. They were caught before dawn. The legion's outriders patrolled a 5-mile radius specifically to prevent desertion. The centurions brought them back in chains and administered punishment that was technically legal, but functionally torture. Each deserter received fustuarium, beaten to death by their own century using clubs and fists. The punishment served multiple purposes: elimination of cowards, deterrent to future desertion, and collective guilt that bonded the century through shared violence. Marcus participated in the beating. He had no choice. Refusal meant receiving the same punishment. His fist broke the deserter's ribs, shattered his jaw, ruptured organs. The man died after 18 minutes, choking on blood and bone fragments. The second deserter lasted 23 minutes. Afterward, Marcus's hands were swollen and bloody. He couldn't feel his knuckles. The physical pain was manageable. The psychological weight of having killed a fellow Roman was substantially worse. But that weight was shared across 80 men, diluted the same way combat fear was diluted. No individual bore sole responsibility. The Testudo's logic extended beyond combat. Collective action distributed moral burden until it became sustainable. The legion crossed into truly hostile territory on day 23. The forests grew denser, roads deteriorated into tracks barely wide enough for wagons, and the sense of being watched intensified from paranoia to certainty. Germanic scouts appeared openly now, standing on ridgelines just beyond javelin range, counting Roman numbers, assessing the column's strength. The primus pilus, the the legion's senior centurion, explained this was deliberate provocation. The Germans wanted Romans to break formation and chase them, creating opportunities for ambush in the forest where Testudo tactics couldn't function. We hope you have already subscribed to our channel, and if not, please do so right now. Our goal is to reach our first 1,000 subscribers. This is very important to us. Only on our channel will you find such interesting and unique stories about wars. Subscribe so you don't miss them, and we'll get back to the story. The column maintained absolute discipline. Individual scouts were ignored. The legion proceeded at standard pace, constructed full fortifications every night, and refused to acknowledge the psychological pressure. This required extraordinary mental endurance. Every legionary could see the Germanic scouts, could calculate how easy it would be to chase them down, could feel the insult of being watched and assessed like animals. But individual impulses were subordinated to collective tactics. The Testudo wasn't just a battlefield formation. It was a complete philosophical system that subordinated ego to effectiveness. The tribal drums returned on night 25, louder now, close enough that Marcus could feel the bass rhythm vibrating through the ground. Multiple drum groups were coordinating, creating overlapping patterns designed to sound like armies vastly larger than intelligence suggested. The psychological sophistication was impressive. Germanic tribes had fought Romans for over 2 centuries, learning their weaknesses, developing counters to Roman tactics. They understood that Roman strength came from discipline, so they attacked discipline through psychological pressure that accumulated gradually until even veteran legionaries started making mistakes. But the Germans had no answer for the Testudo's fundamental mathematics. Individual warriors, no matter how brave or skilled, generated limited combat power. Collective formations multiplied effectiveness geometrically. 80 men in proper Testudo could defeat 500 individual warriors through sheer mechanical efficiency. The formation absorbed casualties, rotated tired fighters to the rear, maintained pressure indefinitely. Germanic courage meant they would die gloriously. Roman discipline meant they would survive to fight tomorrow. The psychological gulf was unbridgeable. Tribal warfare valued individual honor while Rome valued systematic effectiveness. Marcus understood this intellectually but hadn't experienced it physically. The training, the marches, the fortification construction, the brutal punishment details, all of it was preparation for the moment when Germanic warriors crashed against the shield wall and discovered that Roman discipline was stronger than barbarian courage. That moment was approaching rapidly. The scouts reported major tribal concentrations ahead, multiple Germanic peoples gathering in unprecedented alliance. The Marcomanni and Quadi had united, possibly with Yazygi's cavalry support. Intelligence suggested combined forces approaching 20,000 warriors. The legion numbered 5,400 effective combatants. The mathematics seemed unfavourable until you factored in the Testudo's geometric multiplication of effectiveness. 20,000 individual warriors versus 5,400 components of a unified killing machine. The centurions showed no concern. They'd seen this before. They knew how it ended. The column encountered its first bodies on day 27. Roman civilians this time, an entire settlement of farmers who'd ignored evacuation orders and tried to defend their land. The Germans had methodically butchered everyone, including children, livestock, and dogs. The bodies had been arranged in specific patterns that suggested ritual significance, rather than random violence. Women were staked to the ground in a circle around a central fire pit. Men were hung from trees with their intestines pulled out and draped over lower branches. The children had been gathered in the village's small temple to Mars and burned alive inside it. The doors were still barred from outside. The legion didn't stop. The column marched directly through the settlement, maintaining formation and pace as if the corpses were simply terrain features. Centurions barked orders that kept men focused on foot placement and shield positioning rather than the horror surrounding them. This wasn't callousness, it was tactical necessity. Germanic scouts were watching from the tree line, gauging Roman reactions, looking for signs of psychological breakdown that would indicate vulnerability. The proper response was demonstrating that dead civilians generated zero emotional impact, because legionaries existed to kill, not to feel. Marcus walked past a burned child, its body contracted into the pugilistic pose that fire victims assumed, fists raised as if still fighting. His stomach clenched, but his feet maintained perfect cadence. The man beside him, Cassius, who had a daughter roughly the same age, showed no expression whatsoever. The psychological compartmentalization required to function in this environment was its own form of violence. They were deliberately killing empathy, severing the neural connections that made them respond to suffering, transforming into creatures that could march through atrocity without breaking stride. The cremation details for Rome's dead worked through the night while the legion fortified camp. The sheer number of bodies, over 300 civilians, meant mass pyres rather than individual funerals. The Optio read abbreviated rites over the burning corpses, condensing what should have been hours of religious ceremony into 15 minutes of rapid Latin formulas. The smell was overwhelming. Burning human fat created thick smoke that clung to clothing and hair and couldn't be washed away. Marcus volunteered for the cremation detail because refusing would mark him as weak, but afterward he couldn't eat for 2 days. His body rejected food, knowing it had processed air thick with atomized human remains. The road deteriorated into barely navigable track on day 28. This was deliberate sabotage. Germans had destroyed stone paving, filled drainage ditches, and felled trees across strategic points. The Legion's engineers worked continuously, clearing obstacles and conducting emergency repairs while combat units maintained defensive perimeter. The pace slowed to 12 miles daily, which meant the column was vulnerable to harassment attacks that could disengage before Roman formations could respond effectively. The Germanic strategy was becoming clear: delay the legion's advance, exhaust the men through continuous labour, create psychological pressure through ambient threat that never materialized into actual combat. The night attacks began that same evening. Not full assaults, but probing raids designed to prevent sleep and identify weak points. Groups of 20 to 30 warriors would emerge from darkness, throw javelins at the palisade, loose arrows at guard towers, then disappear before Roman response could organize. The attacks came in irregular intervals: midnight, then nothing until 3 hours before dawn, then twice in rapid succession. The randomness prevented adaptation. Guards couldn't relax because the next attack might come any minute. Sleep-deprived men made mistakes. Mistakes created vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities meant death. Marcus's sentry drew perimeter duty during the 4th night raid. He stood in full armour at the eastern wall, shield ready, palum in hand, watching shadows that might be trees or might be Germans moving through darkness. The attack came from the opposite wall, a diversion that drew attention away from the actual infiltration attempt at the southern gate. 10 Germanic warriors had smeared themselves with ash, crawled through drainage ditches and reached the palisade before sentries noticed. They carried specialized equipment: rope ladders, hooked blades for cutting through wooden defences, and small bucklers instead of large shields for greater mobility. The infiltrators killed 3 Romans before the alarm sounded. 2 guards had their throats cut from behind, dying without making noise. The 3rd managed to scream before a blade opened his belly. The sentry stationed at the southern gate responded within seconds. This was exactly the scenario they drilled endlessly. The Testudo formed in darkness, a purely kinesthetic accomplishment that required no vision or coordination beyond muscle memory. Shields locked, the formation advanced toward the breach point, sealing off the infiltrators from the rest of the camp. The Germans discovered they'd penetrated a trap more sophisticated than any physical fortification. They couldn't retreat. The Testudo blocked their escape route. They couldn't advance. More formations were sealing interior routes. They couldn't disperse. Roman camp layout channeled movement into predetermined killing zones. The infiltrators were dead within 90 seconds, cut down by gladius thrusts from multiple angles, while unable to effectively counter the shield wall. Their bodies were left where they fell until morning as psychological message. Roman discipline converted tactical sophistication into corpses. The attacks continued nightly, but never achieved surprise again. The legion adapted faster than Germanic tactics evolved. Guard rotations increased, overlapping fields of observation eliminated blind spots, and the sentries developed non-verbal communication systems that allowed alerts without sound. The geese proved invaluable, raising alarm at infiltration attempts humans couldn't detect. 3 more night raids failed completely, the attackers driven off with casualties before reaching the palisade. The psychological warfare was backfiring. Instead of exhausting Romans, the failed raids were demonstrating Germanic inability to counter even basic Roman defensive doctrine. The column reached the Danube on day 31. The great river stretched nearly a mile wide here, grey water moving with deceptive speed. The far bank belonged to Germania, untamed forests where Roman discipline meant nothing, and tribal warriors held every advantage. The legion's mission was establishing a forward base on this Roman bank, creating infrastructure for eventual crossing and offensive operations into Germanic territory. But first, they needed to survive contact with enemy forces that now numbered, according to scout reports, over 25,000 warriors gathered specifically to destroy this legion. The tribal coalition was unprecedented. Marcomanni King Balamar had united multiple Germanic peoples through a combination of diplomacy, intimidation, and the compelling argument that Romans were existential threat to all free peoples. The Quadi had contributed their best warriors. The Aziz provided elite cavalry from the steppes, horse archers who could fire backwards at full gallop and devastate infantry formations. Even smaller tribes who normally maintained neutrality had sent contingents. This wasn't opportunistic raiding. This was coordinated military campaign with strategic objectives and tactical planning. The legion began fortification construction immediately upon reaching the Danube. The base would be permanent, featuring stone walls, towers, barracks, granaries, workshops, and all infrastructure necessary for sustained military operations. But construction took months, and the Germanic army was gathering miles away, building courage through ritual and alcohol. The timeline was simple: finish fortifications before the Germans attacked, or die fighting without defensive advantages. The entire legion worked 18-hour days, digging foundations, quarrying stone, cutting timber, mixing mortar. Even officers performed manual labour because manpower was the limiting factor. Marcus's sentry was assigned earthworks, digging the massive ditch that would surround the stone walls. The ditch needed to be 15 feet wide and 10 feet deep for 2 miles of perimeter. The Danube soil was clay mixed with river stones, difficult to excavate and harder to remove. They worked in shifts, some men digging while others hauled baskets of excavated material to form ramparts. The physical labour was crushing even for men conditioned by training and marching. Hands blistered, then bled, then calloused over bleeding flesh. Backs seized from repetitive shoveling motion. The centurion showed no mercy, because mercy meant the fortifications wouldn't finish in time. The Germanic army appeared on the horizon on day 37 of construction, not attacking, just observing from elevated ground 3 miles distant. Marcus could see them from the ramparts, thousands of warriors, their numbers making the landscape seem to shift and move. Tribal standards flew above the mass, each one representing a different people united in common cause. The psychological impact was carefully calculated. The Germans wanted Romans to see the overwhelming numerical superiority, to understand that the Testudo's tactical advantages might not matter when facing 10-to-1 odds. The Primus Pilus assembled the entire legion that evening, addressing them from atop the partially completed eastern gate tower. He spoke in the blunt language of professional soldiers, no rhetoric or appeals to glory. The numbers were unfavourable but not unprecedented. Roman formations had defeated worse odds. The Danube protected one flank, the partial fortifications provided defensive advantages, and Germanic coalition forces always suffered from coordination problems between tribes accustomed to independent operation. The legion's task was simple: maintain formation, follow orders, trust the system. Individual survival was unlikely, but collective survival was probable. The honesty was psychologically sophisticated. Pretending the situation wasn't dangerous would have insulted the legionaries' intelligence. Acknowledging the genuine threat while expressing confidence in Roman tactical doctrine validated their fears, while providing rational framework for managing those fears. The men understood they might die, but believed their deaths would serve purpose beyond individual extinction. The Testudo's psychological architecture required this specific balance: absolute realism about danger combined with absolute faith in collective effectiveness. The first probing attack came at dawn the next day. 300 Germanic warriors advanced toward the construction site, not in formation but as loose skirmish line that could adapt to terrain and opportunity. They threw javelins from maximum range, testing Roman response times and defensive capabilities. The legion's answer was textbook. 2 cohorts formed Testudo, advanced to javelin range, threw pila in coordinated volley, then locked shields and waited. The pila were devastating. Each 7-foot javelin punched through Germanic shields, the iron shank penetrating wood and often continuing through into the warrior behind. 60 Germans died in that single volley. The survivors retreated but gained valuable intelligence. They'd measured Roman response time, assessed the fortification's incomplete sections, and identified the construction equipment that represented vulnerability. The Germans returned that night, not with warriors but with fire arrows. Burning projectiles arced through darkness, targeting timber stockpiles, wooden scaffolding, and thatched roofing on temporary structures. The legion's firefighting response was equally practiced. Bucket chains from the Danube, wet leather covers for critical supplies, and sacrifice of non-essential structures to create fire breaks. The Germans burned 3 weeks of prepared timber, but the stone walls continued rising. The psychological pressure intensified daily. Germanic warriors would approach within shouting distance, hurling insults in broken Latin mixed with their own languages. They described in graphic detail what they'd do to captured Romans, how Roman women and children back in the settlements would be treated, what tortures awaited anyone taken alive. The tribal shamans performed rituals visible from Roman positions: animal sacrifices, frenzied dancing, collective chanting designed to invoke their gods and intimidate the civilized Romans, who surely must fear such savage displays. Marcus watched these performances while hauling stone blocks. The psychological manipulation was obvious once you understood its purpose: make Romans think of themselves as civilized and therefore vulnerable to savage violence, create mental image of torture and rape that would make men fight desperately when the real battle came. The counter was cognitive reframing. Romans weren't civilized. They were the most effective killers in human history, with kill counts that dwarfed anything Germanic tribes could imagine. The torture displays weren't threats. They were admissions that Germans couldn't defeat Roman formations through legitimate combat and needed psychological edges. A deserter attempted to flee on day 42. He made it 12 feet beyond the palisade before Germanic archers turned him into a pincushion, 8 arrows in his back and legs, deliberately avoiding fatal wounds. The Germans dragged him away screaming while the entire legion watched from the ramparts. They crucified him within sight of the fortress but didn't kill him. They kept him alive through periodic water and crude medical treatment, ensuring his screams would continue for days. The psychological message was explicit. Rome won't save you. Escape is impossible. Your only options are discipline or prolonged agony. The screaming continued for 3 days. The deserter's voice echoed across the construction site constantly, degrading from human speech to animal, howling to wet gurgling as his throat ruptured. Nobody could ignore it. The sound penetrated sleep, interrupted conversation, created ambient psychological pressure that accumulated in every legionary's mind. The centurions finally sent a marksman with a specialized crossbow to mercy kill the deserter from maximum range. The bolt took him through the eye socket, ending the screaming instantly. The Germans left the corpse hanging, a permanent reminder visible from every construction position. The fortification walls reached full height on day 53. The gate towers were completed, the internal barracks were habitable, and the granaries held sufficient supplies for 3-month siege. The legion had accomplished a construction miracle through sheer brutal labour, building permanent fortress in territory where Germanic armies vastly outnumbered them. The psychological equation had shifted. The incomplete fortifications had been vulnerability that bred anxiety. The completed fortress was advantage that generated confidence. The same men who'd been exhausted and fearful now looked toward the massed Germanic army with anticipation rather than dread. The German king Balamar understood the strategic situation perfectly. His window for successful attack was closing. Once the Romans fully fortified and received reinforcements, the tribal coalition would lose its numerical advantage and face systematic destruction. He needed to attack now while conditions still favoured the Germans, while his warriors maintained battle fury that would dissipate if postponed. The attack would come soon, probably within days. The entire legion knew it. They slept in armour, weapons within reach, shield stacks positioned at strategic intervals. The waiting was its own form of combat, psychological endurance test that determined whether men would function effectively when violence finally erupted. Marcus stood watch the night before the battle, knowing without being told that tomorrow would transform everything. The Germanic campfires stretched to the horizon, thousands of individual flames representing warriors preparing for combat through alcohol, drugs, ritual, and collective frenzy. The Roman fortress was comparatively dark, men conserving strength through sleep, trusting fortifications and discipline rather than divine intervention. Two completely opposed philosophies of warfare preparing to collide. Individual courage versus collective system. Savage enthusiasm versus practiced technique. The outcome was mathematically predictable, but mathematics required human components willing to stand in formation, while friends died and enemies screamed and every survival instinct commanded flight. Marcus would discover tomorrow whether 6 months of training had actually transformed him into a component reliable enough for the machine's requirements. The Germanic army began its advance at dawn, emerging from the forests in a mass that transformed the landscape into living, screaming humanity. 28,000 warriors according to final scout counts, outnumbering the Roman legion 5-1, moving in loose tribal formations that prioritized individual glory over tactical coordination. The front ranks were naked from the waist up despite temperatures barely above freezing, their torsos painted with ritual symbols in blue woad and ochre. These were the berserkers, warriors who'd consumed amanita mushrooms mixed with mead, inducing dissociative states where pain receptors shut down and inhibitions vanished completely. The legion formed outside the fortress walls in standard triplex aces, three-line formation with cohorts staggered for mutual support and tactical flexibility. Marcus's sentry occupied the second line's right flank, positioned where they could either reinforce the front or wheel to counter-flanking attacks. The Primus Pilus had chosen to meet the Germans in open battle, rather than sheltering behind fortifications because psychological dominance mattered as much as tactical victory. Romans needed to demonstrate that their formations could defeat superior numbers in direct combat, establishing precedent that would shape future engagements throughout the campaign. The wait was worse than Marcus had imagined. The Testudo formed a quarter-mile from the fortress, shields locked, every man visible to the approaching horde but nobody permitted to speak or shift position. The Germanic advance was deliberately slow, designed to maximize psychological pressure on the stationary Romans. Tribal shamans walked before the mass, calling on Wotan and Donar, promising divine favor and immortal glory. Warriors crashed weapons against shields in synchronized rhythm, creating thunder that rolled across the open ground like physical force. The sound penetrated bone, made teeth vibrate, triggered primal fear responses that 6 months of training struggled to suppress. The berserkers led the psychological assault by 300 yards, running ahead of the main body in groups of 30 or 40, working themselves into frenzy through spinning, shrieking, and self-mutilation. They cut their own arms and chests with knives, smearing blood across their faces, demonstrating their immunity to pain and mortality. Some bit their own shields until teeth broke, foam mixing with blood at the corners of their mouths. The display was calculated to make civilized Romans understand they faced creatures beyond rationality, enemies who couldn't be deterred by normal combat because they'd transcended human limitations through divine possession. Marcus stood in the third rank, seeing only the backs of helmets in front of him, listening to the approaching storm of noise and knowing the collision was minutes away. His right hand gripped the gladius so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. His left arm held the scutum in position that had become automatic through endless drill. His breathing was shallow, rapid, entirely inadequate for his body's oxygen demands. The man beside him, Decimus, was whispering prayers to Mars in continuous stream, the words blending into meaningless sound. Behind them, someone vomited, the smell sharp and acidic in the cold morning air. The centurion's whistle signalled advance. The Testudo began moving forward at precisely 75 paces per minute, the mathematical optimum for maintaining formation while covering ground. The movement transformed individual terror into collective action. Marcus's feet moved because the men around him were moving, because stopping meant breaking formation, because the system that had been drilled into his nervous system overrode conscious decision-making. The shield wall advanced as unified surface, each man's shield overlapping the next by exactly 4 inches, the overhead shields angled at 45 degrees to deflect incoming missiles. The Germans began throwing javelins at 200 yards, well beyond their weapons' effective range. The framey arced high, falling like iron rain onto the Testudo's overhead shields. The impact sounded like hailstones on tile roofs, hundreds of simultaneous strikes creating continuous metallic thunder. Most deflected off the angled shields exactly as designed. Some punched through where shields weren't perfectly positioned, the long iron shanks penetrating wood and continuing downward into the men beneath. A legionary 2 positions to Marcus's left took a javelin through the top of his shoulder, the point emerging from his armpit. He made a sound like air escaping from a punctured wineskin but maintained formation. The Testudo continued advancing, shields now bristling with embedded javelins that hadn't penetrated completely, but added weight that made arms tremble and shoulders scream. The overhead shield carriers bore the worst of it, each man supporting 25 pounds of shield plus an additional 30 pounds of dangling framey. The mathematics of Germanic javelin tactics became clear. They weren't trying to kill Romans with the initial barrage, but to weight the formation down until it became immobile, transforming Roman discipline advantage into liability. At 100 yards, the legion's front rank threw their pila in synchronized volley. 1,800 javelins launched simultaneously, arcing up and then falling onto the massed Germanic warriors with devastating effect. The pilum was specifically engineered for penetration, 7-foot overall length, with a soft iron shank that bent on impact, making the weapon impossible to throw back while the iron point punched through shields, chainmail, and human bodies with equal efficiency. The German front ranks collapsed as if scythed, warriors falling with javelins through chests, abdomens, throats. The survivors couldn't remove the weapons from their shields. Bent iron shanks made extraction impossible. They abandoned the shields or continued carrying them with 30 pounds of dead weight attached. The second volley launched 10 seconds later. Another 1,800 pila, another devastating harvest of Germanic dead and wounded. The tribal advance wavered as warriors in the rear ranks encountered the screaming wounded, saw the sheer volume of casualties, and confronted the reality that Roman discipline was more lethal than berserker courage. The shamans shrieked encouragement, the chiefs bellowed orders, and the mass surged forward again through pure momentum. 25,000 warriors couldn't stop on command even if they wanted to. The pressure from behind propelled the front ranks forward, regardless of individual decisions. The collision happened at 50 yards, closer than doctrine recommended but forced by Germanic momentum. The berserkers hit the shield wall first, throwing themselves against it with inhuman fury born of mushroom-induced dissociation and absolute certainty of divine protection. A warrior wielding a 2-handed axe crashed into the section, 3 positions to Marcus's right, the blade descending with enough force to split a shield in half and cave in the skull of the man behind it. The shield wall buckled. This was the critical moment. Formation integrity versus overwhelming pressure. The Testudo's design revealed its genius under maximum stress. The fallen legionary's position was immediately filled by the man from the rank behind, who stepped forward into the gap while his own position was filled from the third rank. The system moved like liquid, adapting to casualties without breaking overall structure. The berserker who'd killed the first Roman was already dead, 3 gladius thrusts from different angles puncturing his ribs before he could withdraw his axe. His body fell against the shield wall and was trampled by the Germans behind him. Marcus rotated to the front rank sooner than expected. The casualties were heavier than training scenarios had simulated. Suddenly his shield was the first line of defense, nothing between him and the screaming mass of Germanic warriors, except 22 pounds of curved wooden leather. The world compressed into the narrow slit between his shield's upper edge and the helmet of the man who'd been in front of him. That slit contained a nightmare of faces twisted with rage and pain, weapons descending from impossible angles, blood spraying from wounds he couldn't see. The gladius work was entirely automatic. His right arm executed the thrust-withdraw pattern. 10,000 repetitions had burned into muscle memory, driving the blade forward through gaps in shields and bodies, feeling resistance as iron penetrated flesh, withdrawing before the blade could stick in ribs or be grabbed by dying hands. The kills were anonymous. Faces appeared, The gladius thrust, faces disappeared. No time to register features or acknowledge the humanity of the men he was killing. They were targets that appeared and needed to be eliminated before they eliminated him. A Germanic spear punched past his shield's edge, the point scraping along his helmet with a shriek of metal on metal. The force of the blow snapped his head sideways, vision blurring, ears ringing from the impact. His neck should have broken. The helmet's design, padded interior and reinforced cheek guards, distributed the force enough that he remained conscious and functional. The warrior who'd thrust the spear was already dead, killed by the man on Marcus's left, whose gladius had found the gap between the German's ribs and his inadequate leather armour. The front rank was supposed to rotate backward after 15 minutes of direct combat. That was doctrine, the sustainable rhythm that allowed fresh fighters to replace exhausted ones. But the pressure was too intense, the casualties too heavy, and the rotation system broke down into desperate improvisation. Marcus fought in the front rank for what felt like hours, but was probably 30 minutes, his arm moving in mechanical repetition, while his mind retreated to some internal space where the horror couldn't quite reach. The dissociation was similar to what the berserkers achieved through drugs, except Marcus's version came from pure psychological necessity. The Germanic chief appeared in Marcus's view slit, a giant of a man wearing a bear skin and wielding an axe that looked designed for splitting logs rather than combat. The chief was directing warriors toward weak points in the Roman line, coordinating attacks with tactical sophistication that contradicted the stereotype of barbarian chaos. He identified Marcus's section as vulnerable, probably because the casualties had created slight gaps in the shield overlap. The chief led 40 elite warriors directly toward that point, the axe descending toward the shield wall with enough force to shatter wooden bone. The impact lifted Marcus off his feet. The axe split his shield vertically, the blade continuing through and striking the chest plate of his lorica segmentata with force that stopped his heart for 2 beats. He fell backward into the men behind him, creating exactly the gap the chief had targeted. Germanic warriors poured through like water through a broken dam, their weapons rising and falling on the Romans who'd lost formation integrity. This was the nightmare scenario every training drill had prepared them for, the shield wall developing a breach that could spread and collapse the entire formation. The Testudo's emergency protocol activated automatically. The men behind Marcus didn't try to help him up or close the gap individually. Instead, the entire section executed tortoise configuration, shields overhead locking so tightly that they formed a complete metal shell. The formation abandoned advancement and focused solely on survival, creating a defensive sphere that attackers could swarm but not penetrate. Germans climbed on top of the tortoise, stabbing downward through gaps, but the overlapping shields meant each thrust had maybe 1 chance in 20 of finding flesh. Marcus crawled on hands and knees beneath the protective shell, his chest feeling like someone had driven a spear between his ribs. The lorica segmentata had held, the overlapping plates distributing the axe's force across his entire torso, instead of concentrating it at the impact point. But the blunt trauma had cracked at least 2 ribs and possibly damaged internal organs. Each breath produced sharp pain that suggested punctured lung. He reached the tortoise's centre where wounded men gathered, the safest position within the formation, and discovered Quintus dying from a spear through the throat. Quintus had shared Marcus's tent since training began, the same man who told jokes during night watches and received letters from a wife he'd never see again. The spear had severed his carotid artery. Blood sprayed in arterial jets that painted the inside of the overhead shields crimson. The medicus was trying to apply pressure, but the wound was catastrophically unsurvivable. Quintus's eyes found Marcus, widening with recognition, his mouth working soundlessly around the iron shaft embedded in his neck. He died without speaking, the light leaving his eyes while the battle raged centimeters above his head. The section held tortoise configuration for 20 minutes, while the rest of the cohort conducted a flanking maneuver that relieved pressure on their position. The cost was 8 dead and 14 wounded badly enough to be combat ineffective. The Germanic casualties were impossible to count because the bodies were piled so densely around the shield wall, but the ratio was probably 12-1 in Rome's favour. The mathematical logic of the Testudo was proving itself, collective discipline defeating individual courage through systematic efficiency that converted battles into equations where Romans simply couldn't lose unless something catastrophic disrupted the formation. The cohort to Marcus's left executed that flanking attack with textbook precision. They'd wheeled 90 degrees, formed fresh Testudo, and advanced into the Germanic flank while the enemy was focused on the frontal assault. The pila volleys at close range were devastating, punching through warriors who had no shields or whose shields were facing the wrong direction. The Germans discovered they were being killed from an unexpected angle, creating confusion that spread through their ranks like panic contagion. Tribal warfare lacked the command and control systems to respond effectively to multi-directional threats. The Germanic army's cohesion began deteriorating as individual tribes started making independent decisions. The Marcomanni chiefs were ordering continued assault. The Quadi were attempting to wheel and address the flank attack. The Usig's cavalry hadn't committed yet, remaining in reserve and watching the infantry get slaughtered. The coordination problems that always plagued tribal coalitions were manifesting under combat stress, creating exploitable gaps between forces that should have been supporting each other. The Romans pressed those gaps ruthlessly, inserting fresh cohorts that split the Germanic mass into smaller groups that could be isolated and destroyed. King Balamar attempted to rally his forces by leading a personal charge toward the Roman centre. He gathered 2,000 elite warriors, the best fighters from multiple tribes, and led them in a concentrated assault designed to break through Roman lines through sheer momentum and courage. The charge was magnificent in its savagery, painted warriors screaming war cries, weapons raised, absolutely convinced that their collective courage and divine favour would shatter the disciplined but spiritually inferior Romans. They were completely, catastrophically wrong. The Roman centre received the charge in quadruple testudo, 4 lines deep instead of the standard configuration, creating such massive collective weight that the Germanic charge might as well have run into a stone wall. The front Germanic ranks crashed against the shield wall and simply stopped, their momentum absorbed by mathematically optimised overlapping surfaces and the combined mass of 1,600 legionaries locked into unified structure. The Germans behind couldn't stop, creating a crushing press that suffocated warriors before Romans needed to kill them. Men died standing up, ribs cracking from compression, unable to fall because the press of bodies held them vertical. The gladius work in that meat grinder was industrialized slaughter. Roman short swords thrust through gaps, withdrew, thrust again in mechanical rhythm that harvested Germanic lives with assembly line efficiency. The warriors couldn't effectively use their longer weapons in the crushing press. The Romans' 18-inch blades were perfect for the confined space, each thrust finding exposed flesh, each withdrawal leaving a wound that would prove fatal within minutes. The killing wasn't glorious or heroic. It was skilled butchers processing meat that happened to scream and bleed. Balamar died somewhere in that crushing mass, his body lost among hundreds of others, his attempt to inspire victory through personal courage becoming just another data point in the mathematics of Roman tactical superiority. The elite warriors he'd gathered were annihilated within 30 minutes, their bodies creating a rampart that subsequent Germanic attacks had to climb over. The psychological impact on the remaining tribal warriors was devastating. If their best fighters, led by their king, achieving total surprise and numerical superiority, couldn't break a Roman formation, what chance did anyone else have? The Germanic army began disintegrating around midday, 6 hours after the battle began. Warriors started drifting away from the combat, individually at first, then in groups, then in entire tribal contingents that decided survival was preferable to glorious death. The Uzig's cavalry never committed, recognizing that their mobility advantages meant nothing against formations that couldn't be broken. They withdrew intact, riding east and leaving the infantry to their fate. The remaining Germans tried to retreat in organized fashion, but discovered that Roman pursuit doctrine was as ruthlessly efficient as Roman defensive tactics. The legion's cavalry, small force compared to the infantry but highly trained, pursued the retreating Germans for 12 miles, killing stragglers and preventing any attempt to reform. The skirmishers and velites hunted isolated warriors, using javelins and slings to bring down men too exhausted to defend themselves. The battlefield transformed into hunting ground, where Romans killed fleeing enemies with the same methodical efficiency they'd used during the main engagement. By dusk, the Germanic army had ceased to exist as functional force. 28,000 warriors had been reduced to fewer than 6,000 survivors, most of whom were wounded, demoralized, and scattered across 50 square miles of hostile territory. Marcus sat among the Roman wounded after the pursuit ended, his chest wrapped in bandages soaked with blood and the vinegar solution Medici used as antiseptic. 2 cracked ribs, severe bruising, possible internal bleeding, but alive and likely to recover. Around him, 200 other wounded legionaries received treatment or waited for mercy killing if their wounds proved incompatible with survival. The Roman casualties totaled 374 dead and roughly 600 wounded. Against 22,000 Germanic dead, the ratio was approximately 60-1, testament to tactical doctrine that converted battles into mathematical certainty. The field after Testudo combat resembled industrial killing site more than traditional battlefield. The Germanic bodies were piled so densely around former Roman positions that the ground wasn't visible beneath them. The corpses displayed distinctive wound patterns, concentrated stabbing trauma to torso and throat, minimal slashing injuries, almost no defensive wounds on arms or hands. This was the signature of gladius work from behind shields, quick thrusts to vital organs by soldiers who never exposed themselves to counterattack, efficient, repeatable, scalable to whatever numbers the situation required. Quintus's body was among those prepared for cremation that evening. The rituals were abbreviated because there were too many dead to give each one full ceremony. The Optio read names, centuries and years of service, then consigned the corpses to flames that would burn through the night. Marcus watched his tentmate's body curl and blacken in the fire, remembering jokes and shared meals and the expression in Quintus's eyes as he died. The grief was real but compartmentalized, filed away in whatever mental space held the things soldiers couldn't process during active campaigns. There would be time for mourning after the war, if he survived that long. For now, there was only the formation, the discipline, and the knowledge that tomorrow might bring another battle where the mathematics would determine who lived and died, regardless of individual worth or desire. The Testudo's true nature revealed itself not in the moments of collision, but in the sustained combat that followed, when the formation became a living organism that breathed, shifted, and killed with collective consciousness transcending individual thought. Marcus experienced this during the second major engagement 3 weeks after the first battle, when a reformed Germanic coalition attempted another assault with modified tactics specifically designed to counter Roman shield wall doctrine. The Germans had learned from their catastrophic losses and adapted their approach with disturbing sophistication. The new Germanic strategy focused on exhaustion rather than breakthrough. Instead of massed charges, they sent continuous waves of 50 to 100 warriors who would engage the Testudo for exactly 3 minutes before withdrawing and being replaced by fresh fighters. The rotation system meant Romans faced constant pressure without the psychological relief of enemy retreat or the physical respite between attacks. The Testudo had to maintain formation continuously for hours, while Germanic warriors cycled through, each group expending maximum effort for minimal time before rotating to rest. Marcus stood in the third rank during this engagement, pressed so tightly against the men around him that individual identity dissolved into collective physical mass. The pressure was claustrophobic beyond anything training had simulated. Cassius's back was inches from Marcus's face, close enough to see individual hairs on his neck, to smell the rancid olive oil Romans used to waterproof leather armor. The man behind Marcus, Titus, a veteran of 4 years, was pressed equally close, his breath hot against Marcus's helmet. The formation was so compressed that fallen men couldn't physically collapse, but remained vertical, held upright by the press of bodies. A Germanic spear punched through the shield gap 3 positions to Marcus's left, the iron point emerging from the throat of a legionary named Sergius. Blood sprayed in arterial jets that painted the faces of everyone within 6 feet, warm and copper-tasting when it hit Marcus's lips. Sergius made a wet gurgling sound, hands clawing at the spear shaft embedded in his neck, feet still moving in the marching rhythm because his body hadn't processed that it was dead. The formation continued advancing, stepping over Sergius's twitching legs, maintaining the 75 pace per minute cadence that was more important than any individual life. The Testudo rotated fighters with mechanical precision that occurred automatically after thousands of drill repetitions. The front rank would engage for approximately 15 minutes, though time became impossible to measure during combat, before the centurion's whistle triggered rotation. The front rank would shuffle backward through the formation, while the second rank moved forward and the third rank became second. The system meant every man eventually cycled to the front, experienced direct combat, killed or was killed, then rotated backward to recover before the cycle repeated. Marcus rotated to the front rank during the 4th wave of Germanic attacks. The transition was disorienting, one moment seeing only Cassius's back, the next moment facing a wall of screaming faces and descending weapons. The world compressed into the narrow slit between his shield's upper edge and the bottom of his helmet, a constrained field of vision maybe 8 inches tall and 2 feet wide. Everything beyond that slit ceased to exist. Reality became the immediate threat, the axe descending toward his head, the spear thrusting toward his exposed right side, the painted warrior trying to hook his shield and pull it down. The gladius work in the front rank required split-second threat assessment and response. A warrior's chest presented itself in the narrow gap between shields. Marcus's right arm thrust forward automatically, the 18-inch blade punching between ribs with resistance that felt like pushing through thick leather. Withdraw. A different face appeared, mouth open in mid-scream, thrust low beneath the sternum, angling upward toward the heart. The warrior's eyes widened with the specific surprise of men who didn't expect to die today. Withdraw. A shield edge appeared, trying to hook Marcus's scutum. Punch forward with the shield boss, the iron hemisphere smashing into the attacker's face with enough force to break his nose and cheekbones. The kills accumulated without individual significance. Each face was anonymous, each thrust another repetition of the pattern drilled into muscle memory, each death just another data point in the formation's continuous operation. The lack of emotional engagement wasn't callousness, but psychological survival mechanism. Registering each kill as significant human death would have caused mental breakdown within minutes. The brain simply stopped processing the violence as meaningful, converting it into abstract mechanical operation, where the gladius went in and out and bodies fell and the next target appeared. The psychological intimacy of formation combat was worse than the physical violence. Marcus could smell the fear sweat of the men around him, feel their bodies trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline, hear their whispered prayers and involuntary whimpers. Decimus was crying while continuing to thrust his gladius in perfect rhythm, tears streaming down his face as he killed efficiently and wept continuously. The man behind Marcus, Gaius, recovered from his earlier training collapse, was vomiting periodically, the acidic smell mixing with blood and sweat and the distinctive odour of bowels releasing in the freshly dead. A Germanic warrior managed to grab the upper edge of Marcus's shield, his fingers curling around the rim and pulling downward with desperate strength. The shield tilted, exposing Marcus's face and throat to the spear thrust that followed immediately. The coordination suggested training rather than lucky improvisation. The Germans had specifically practiced this technique to counter Roman shield tactics. The spear point was 6 inches from Marcus's eye when Cassius's gladius appeared from the left, punching through the shield grabber's wrist and severing tendons. The hand released involuntarily, the warrior stumbled backward, screaming and clutching his ruined wrist, and Marcus's shield snapped back into position. The formation was simultaneously protective and imprisoning. The shields blocked most attacks, but also created a metal cage that eliminated escape options. Marcus couldn't retreat even if he wanted to. The press of bodies behind prevented backward movement. He couldn't dodge or duck. The rigid formation required maintaining exact position regardless of threats. His only defensive option was the shield's protection combined with faith that the men around him were maintaining their positions with equal discipline. Individual survival depended entirely on collective integrity. The Testudo began suffering casualties at a rate that threatened formation stability. The Germanic rotation system was working. Fresh warriors were engaging exhausted Romans, pressing attacks until legionaries made mistakes born of fatigue. A man in the front rank dropped his shield from arm failure, the muscle simply refusing to continue holding 22 pounds plus accumulated javelin weight. Germanic weapons descended on him from 3 angles simultaneously, splitting his skull and opening his abdomen before the man beside him could close the gap. The breach created opportunity for more Germans to pour through. The centurion's emergency whistle signalled tortoise configuration. The overhead shields locked together so rapidly and tightly that the formation became a complete metal shell within 5 seconds. Marcus found himself in near total darkness, seeing nothing except the small gaps between shields where fragments of daylight penetrated. The sounds intensified in the confined space. Germanic weapons hammering on the overhead shields created continuous metallic thunder that made thought impossible. Warriors were climbing on top of the tortoise, their weight making the overhead shield carrier's arms tremble and buckle. A spear punched through the gap between 2 overhead shields, the blade descending in the narrow space where Marcus's head and Cassius's back almost touched. The point hit Cassius's shoulder blade, glanced off the bone, and continued downward into Marcus's left arm just above the elbow. The pain was instantaneous and shocking, white-hot agony that made his vision tunnel and his knees weaken. The spear withdrew for another thrust. Marcus couldn't see the attacker, couldn't defend himself, could only trust that the overhead shield carriers would close the gap before the next strike proved fatal. The spear thrust came again, but this time the angle was different. The warrior on top of the tortoise had shifted position, searching for different gap. The blade descended 6 inches to the right of where it had been, missing Marcus entirely but punching through the neck of the man behind him. Gaius made a sound like a cough, blood spraying from his mouth and nose, his body sagging against Marcus's back. The formation was so compressed that Gaius couldn't fall, his dead weight pressing against Marcus while blood ran down Marcus's armor in warm streams. The tortoise configuration held for 8 minutes while the rest of the cohort maneuvered to relieve pressure. Those 8 minutes were psychological eternity. Complete darkness, continuous hammering of weapons on shields, the wet sounds of men dying in the confined space, the weight of a corpse pressed against your back, the smell of blood and voided bowels and fear sweat combining into sensory assault that made rational thought impossible. Marcus's mind retreated to some interior space where the horror couldn't quite reach, a dissociative state similar to shock but functional enough to maintain grip on his gladius and keep his shield positioned correctly. The relief came from an unexpected direction. Yazig's cavalry had committed to the battle, but not in support of the Germanic infantry. The steppe horsemen had been negotiating with Rome throughout the battle, and their price for switching sides was paid in gold and promises of land. 300 horse archers appeared on the Germanic flank, firing backwards at full gallop in the Parthian shot technique that Roman infantry had faced and learned to fear during Eastern campaigns. The arrows weren't individually devastating, but the psychological impact of being attacked from behind by forces they'd expected as allies shattered Germanic cohesion completely. The tribal warriors broke contact and ran. Not organised retreat, but panicked rout. Men throwing down weapons and shields to run faster. Individual survival instinct overriding whatever courage or discipline had brought them to the battlefield. The Testudo emerged from tortoise configuration and discovered a landscape of scattered enemies perfect for systematic slaughter. The centurions ordered pursuit at double-time pace, the formation breaking into smaller hunting groups that ran down fleeing Germans and killed them from behind with mechanical efficiency. Marcus participated in the pursuit despite the spear wound in his arm, the pain transmuted into cold numbness through some combination of adrenaline and psychological dissociation. His gladius rose and fell as he ran, striking fleeing Germans in the back, the kidney, the base of the skull. The kills were even more impersonal than formation combat, just bodies that happened to be in front of him, obstacles that needed eliminating. His mind had stopped registering the violence as significant. The blade went in, the body fell, he moved to the next target. The mechanical repetition was almost meditative. The battlefield after the pursuit resembled mass execution site more than combat zone. Germanic bodies lay scattered across 2 miles of ground, almost all showing wounds to the back that indicated they died running away. The Romans had killed perhaps 4,000 warriors, while suffering 230 casualties themselves, a ratio of roughly 17-1. The mathematical logic of Testudo warfare was proving itself again. Superior discipline and tactics converting numerical parity into one-sided slaughter that looked less like battle and more like organised murder. The medicus examined Marcus's arm that evening, probing the wound with iron instruments that hadn't been cleaned since the last patient. The spear had penetrated muscle and nicked bone but hadn't severed tendons or major blood vessels. The wound would heal if infection didn't set in, which was uncertain given the crude medical conditions and the bacteria inevitably introduced by dirty weapons. The treatment was vinegar solution poured directly into the wound, pain worse than the original injury, followed by honey application and linen bandaging. Marcus would remain combat effective despite the injury, because Roman tactical doctrine assumed roughly 30% casualties were sustainable before formation integrity degraded. Gaius's body was cremated with the others that night. Marcus had known him for 7 months, shared meals and guard duty, and the grinding misery of training. Gaius had survived the training collapse that should have killed him, survived the first major battle, survived long enough to make Marcus think he might actually complete his 25-year enlistment. Then a spear through the neck in the tortoise's darkness, and he was gone. The grief was real, but Marcus had no emotional capacity remaining to process it properly. The loss went into the same mental filing space as Quintus's death, to be addressed later if there was a later. The sentry held formation practice the next morning despite the casualties. 23 men dead meant 23 gaps in the Testudo that needed filling by survivors shifting positions and new replacements integrating into existing tent groups. The shield wall drill was identical to training except everyone was wounded, exhausted, and carrying psychological weight that made the mechanical movements feel surreal. They locked shields, advanced, rotated ranks, formed tortoise, exactly as they'd done 1,000 times before. The muscle memory was so deeply ingrained that bodies performed correctly, even when minds were elsewhere. The third week after that battle brought the realization that had been building since Marcus's first combat. The Testudo worked because it eliminated individual agency entirely. You didn't decide to advance or retreat. You didn't choose when to attack or defend. You didn't determine your own survival. Those decisions were made by centurions executing tactical doctrine refined over centuries. Individual legionaries were components that followed programming, and the programming worked because it had been debugged through enough catastrophic failures to eliminate most fatal errors. The psychological cost of being a component was becoming clear. Marcus noticed changes in himself that should have been alarming but felt inevitable. He no longer reacted emotionally to violence. The sight of bodies, screaming wounded, men dying in creative ways, all of it generated zero visceral response. His dreams had stopped entirely, or at least he couldn't remember them upon waking. His ability to feel anything except the dull background anxiety of waiting for the next battle had diminished to near zero. He was becoming the perfect component, emotionally flatlined and mechanically reliable. The other survivors showed similar transformations. Decimus had stopped praying to Mars. Cassius no longer wrote letters to his wife because writing required caring about a future where the letters might be received, and that future seemed increasingly fictional. Lucius had developed a facial tic that made his left eye twitch continuously, but otherwise functioned with complete competence. They were all damaged in ways that wouldn't be visible until the war ended, and they tried to return to civilian life if they survived that long. The Sentry's newest replacements, fresh recruits from the most recent training cycle, stood out through their emotional reactivity and psychological fragility. They flinched at loud noises. They formed emotional bonds with each other quickly and intensely. They believed they might survive the war and return home. The veterans watched these hopeful youths with the detached interest of people observing a process they'd completed themselves. The recruits would either die or transform into emotionally deadened components. There were no other options. The Testudo didn't accommodate psychological individuality. Marcus rotated to perimeter guard duty on the fortification's eastern wall, scanning forests that held enemies he couldn't see but knew were watching. The tactical situation had stabilized. Germanic forces were scattered and demoralized, unlikely to mount coordinated assaults for months. But the psychological pressure continued. The watchers in the forest, the drums at night, the occasional arrow fired at maximum range. All of it accumulated into ambient stress that never quite resolved into combat or safety. The formation mentality extended into garrison duty. You maintained vigilance not because you cared about surviving, but because breaking vigilance endangered the collective. The sun set over the Danube, painting the river red and gold. Marcus watched the light fade and felt nothing about the beauty. his capacity for aesthetic appreciation had been casualties of transformation into a Testudo component. What remained was mechanical competence, tactical awareness, and the deep knowledge that tomorrow might bring another battle, where the mathematics would determine outcomes and individual desire was irrelevant. He'd survived 3 major engagements. The statistics suggested he had perhaps 5 more before probability caught up with him. Until then, he would maintain his position in the shield wall, thrust his gladius when ordered, and trust that the formation would continue functioning even after he became another name read at evening cremation. The 4th major engagement began wrong and deteriorated from there, starting with terrain that nullified every Testudo advantage and forcing the Legion into combat conditions where Germanic tactics were superior. The battlefield was a river valley 3 miles east of the Danube fortress, chosen by the Germans specifically because the marshy ground and dense vegetation made Roman formation warfare nearly impossible. The Primus Pilus recognized the trap but had no choice except advancing. Germanic forces had captured a supply convoy carrying 2 months of grain, and the Legion would starve without recovering those supplies. The marsh absorbed formation integrity within the first 100 yards. The careful spacing that made the Testudo functional became impossible to maintain when men were sinking ankle-deep into mud with every step. The shield overlap that provided defensive unity broke apart as legionaries struggled with footing that shifted unpredictably. The 75 pace per minute advance rate that allowed formations to maintain pressure while managing exhaustion slowed to perhaps 30 paces as men hauled their feet from sucking mud that seemed determined to pull them underground. Marcus's sentry entered the marsh in standard Testudo configuration and devolved into loose skirmish line within minutes. The overhead shields became liability rather than protection. Men carrying them sank deeper into the mud from the additional weight. Centurions ordered overhead shields lowered, breaking the tortoise shell that made the formation impervious to missiles. Germanic archers immediately began exploiting the vulnerability, firing arrows from concealed positions in the dense vegetation. The arrows came from unpredictable angles, left, right, elevated positions in trees, ground level through gaps in reeds. The carefully drilled response protocols meant nothing when you couldn't see the attackers. A legionary named Flavius took an arrow through his eye socket, the iron point punching through the orbital bone and into his brain. He was dead before his body registered the injury, falling face first into the marsh with a splash that sent mud spraying across the men nearby. The formation couldn't stop to help him or retrieve the body. Stopping in this terrain meant becoming stationary targets for archers who knew every sight line and escape route. Flavius's corpse disappeared beneath the mud within seconds, likely to remain there until the marsh dried out years from now. The Germans had prepared the battlefield with professional attention to detail that shouldn't have been possible for tribal warriors. Sharpened stakes were concealed beneath the mud at angles designed to penetrate Roman sandals and drive up through feet. Rope nets were strung between trees at chest height, invisible until men walked into them and became tangled while trying to maintain shield position. The vegetation itself had been selectively cleared to create narrow corridors that funneled Roman movement into killing zones where massed archers waited. This wasn't opportunistic ambush. This was engineered death trap designed by someone who understood Roman tactical doctrine intimately. Marcus stepped on a concealed stake that punched through his sandal's sole and into his foot with pain that made vision white out momentarily. The stake was barbed, designed to catch in flesh and bone, impossible to remove without causing additional damage. He yanked his foot up anyway, felt the stake tear through muscle and ligaments as it came free, and continued advancing because stopping meant death. The foot was functionally destroyed. He could feel bones grinding wrong with each step, could see blood filling his sandal and overflowing into the mud. The pain was manageable only because adrenaline and combat conditioning had recalibrated his entire relationship with physical suffering. The sentry's formation was completely gone now, replaced by individuals and small groups struggling through hostile terrain while being systematically killed by enemies they couldn't see or reach. This was the nightmare the Testudo was designed to prevent: Roman soldiers exposed as individuals, fighting without mutual support, unable to leverage their tactical advantages. The Germans were winning through terrain selection alone, proving that even Rome's superior military system had fundamental weaknesses when conditions eliminated formation warfare. Germanic infantry emerged from the vegetation in small groups, engaging Romans in close combat that favoured individual skill over collective discipline. These weren't the berserkers from earlier battles, but professional warriors fighting with calculated efficiency. They wore captured Roman armour, carried scavenged gladi alongside traditional weapons, and knew how to exploit the chaos of broken formations. A group of 5 Germans attacked Marcus from 3 directions simultaneously, their coordination suggesting training and practice rather than improvised tactics. Marcus killed the first attacker with a thrust to the throat that was pure reflex rather than conscious decision. The second warrior's axe descended toward his head while he was withdrawing the gladius from the first man's neck. He blocked with his shield, but the mud made footwork impossible. He couldn't step back or pivot as training dictated. The axe bit into his shield's upper edge, splitting wood and leather, the blade stopping 3 inches from his face. The third German thrust a spear toward his exposed right side while he was locked with the axe wielder. Cassius appeared from Marcus's left, his gladius punching through the spear wielder's ribs in textbook thrust and withdraw. The coordination wasn't planned or discussed. It was automatic response from months of fighting side by side, an instinctive understanding of how to support each other even when the formal structure had collapsed. Marcus freed his shield from the axe, letting the weapon remain embedded while he stabbed upward beneath the attacker's jaw. The blade punched through the soft palate and into the brain. The German died standing up, eyes still focused on Marcus with the intensity of someone who didn't know they were already dead. The remaining 2 Germans withdrew into vegetation before Marcus or Cassius could engage them. The tactical discipline was disturbing. These warriors understood when to press attacks and when to disengage, fighting with calculated conservation of force rather than the suicidal bravery earlier Germanic forces had demonstrated. Someone was training them in Roman tactical philosophy, teaching them how to counter formations and exploit weaknesses. The implications were dire. The tribal coalitions were learning, adapting, evolving tactics that might eventually neutralize Rome's systematic advantages. The sentry regrouped in a small clearing that provided minimal defensive position. Of the 80 men who'd entered the marsh, 53 were still combat effective. 12 were dead, lost to arrows, ambush attacks, or the marsh itself claiming men who'd fallen and couldn't rise from the sucking mud. 15 were wounded badly enough that continuing combat was impossible. The centurion attempted to reform Testudo, but the terrain made it functionally useless. Shields sank into soft ground, the overlaps didn't lock properly, and the formation's collective weight made everyone sink deeper. The Germanic chief directing this engagement revealed himself deliberately, standing on elevated ground 200 yards away, where Romans could see him clearly. He was wearing full Roman centurion armour, lorica segmentata, red crest helmet, vine staff of office. All of it captured equipment that had been claimed as trophies. The psychological message was explicit. We understand your system. We've killed your officers. We can become you and use your own methods to destroy you. The chief gestured to unseen forces in the surrounding vegetation, and the coordinated assault began. Warriors attacked from 4 directions simultaneously, using Germanic numbers and Roman tactical coordination in combination that should have been impossible. The Testudo's remaining structure collapsed entirely as men faced threats from multiple angles without the formation's protection. Individual combat skills became paramount, the exact scenario Roman training had been designed to avoid. Marcus found himself fighting back-to-back with Decimus, defending against attackers who came in waves, withdrawing when pressured, advancing when opportunities appeared. They were using Testudo tactics against Romans who couldn't employ Testudo defences. A massive Germanic warrior wielding a captured pilum used it with devastating effectiveness, throwing the 7-foot javelin at close range directly at Marcus's chest. The pilum was designed to penetrate shields, and it did exactly that. The iron shank punched through Marcus's scutum, through the layered wood and leather and canvas, the point emerging on the inside and continuing toward his torso. The lorica segmentata saved him again, the overlapping plates distributing impact force that would have driven the pilum through his chest cavity. The blade penetrated the armour's outer layer but stopped against the second plate. Marcus was knocked backward into Decimus, both men falling into the mud with the pilum still embedded in the shield. Marcus abandoned the shield rather than trying to remove the pilum. The weapon's bent iron shank made extraction impossible, and continuing to carry it meant fighting with 30 pounds of dead weight. He drew his pugio, the backup dagger every legionary carried, and fought with gladius in right hand and dagger in left, a combat style that training discouraged but circumstances demanded. The dual weapons gave him options the Germans weren't expecting. He could parry with the dagger while thrusting with the gladius, or feint with the sword and stab with the knife. The improvisation was sloppy compared to formation tactics, but more effective than trying to maintain shield discipline in terrain that nullified its advantages. The sentry was dying. Not routing or retreating, but being systematically slaughtered by an enemy that had studied Roman methods and developed specific counters. The casualties were approaching 50%, the threshold where unit cohesion typically collapsed entirely. Men were fighting as individuals now, the collective discipline that made the Testudo work replaced by personal survival instinct. Some legionaries were running, trying to escape through the marsh despite knowing the Germanic archers would kill them before they reached solid ground. Others were surrendering, throwing down weapons and raising hands in supplication that would be ignored. The Germans had learned that showing mercy to Romans meant those same Romans would return with reinforcements. The relief force arrived from an unexpected direction. The Yazigi's cavalry had been shadowing the engagement from solid ground beyond the marsh, waiting to see which side deserved their support. The Romans were losing badly enough that betraying them would be profitable, but the German chief's adoption of Roman equipment and tactics apparently offended the steppe nomad's sense of cultural authenticity. 300 horsemen crashed into the Germanic rear not because they valued Roman alliance, but because they despised tribal warriors pretending to be legionaries. The cavalry charge shattered the coordinated Germanic assault within minutes. The warriors had been trained to fight disciplined infantry, not mobile horse archers who fired while riding in circles around their targets. The arrows came from constantly shifting positions, making defence impossible and counterattack futile. The German chief in stolen centurion armour took 3 arrows in rapid succession, throat, chest, abdomen, and fell from his elevated position into the marsh, where his expensive stolen equipment would drag him down and drown him in 18 inches of muddy water. The Germanic forces broke and ran, abandoning the battlefield with losses even heavier than the Romans had suffered. But the victory felt hollow because it had been achieved through cavalry intervention rather than Testudo superiority. Marcus understood the implications even through the pain and exhaustion. Roman tactical doctrine had a fundamental flaw when terrain prevented formation warfare. The Testudo was nearly invincible under correct conditions, but those conditions could be denied by enemies who understood the system well enough to avoid fighting on Rome's terms. The entry withdrew from the marsh, carrying 27 bodies and dragging another 16 wounded who might survive if infection didn't claim them. The supply convoy was recovered, but at catastrophic cost. Over 40% casualties to retrieve grain that would feed the legion for 2 months. The mathematics were barely sustainable. Several more engagements like this one and the sentry would cease to exist as functional unit. Individual legionaries could be replaced, but the collective cohesion that made the Testudo work required time and shared experience that couldn't be manufactured quickly. Marcus's foot was destroyed beyond field medicine's capacity to repair. The medicus examined it by firelight that evening, probing the wound with instruments that made Marcus bite through his leather belt to avoid screaming. The stake had severed multiple tendons, shattered bones, and introduced marsh bacteria that was already generating infection, despite aggressive vinegar treatment. The medical prognosis was amputation or death from sepsis within a week. Roman battlefield surgery was sophisticated enough to perform amputations with reasonable survival rates, but a one-legged legionary was worthless for combat and would be discharged without pension or support. The medicus offered a third option: experimental treatment using maggots to clean dead tissue and honey mixed with wine to fight infection. The success rate was perhaps 30%, but it preserved the possibility of eventually returning to combat duty. Marcus accepted because the alternatives were unthinkable. The treatment involved allowing fly larvae to colonize the wound and consume necrotic flesh while being prevented from eating healthy tissue through careful monitoring. The sensation of maggots moving inside his foot was worse than the original injury. A crawling wrongness that made his skin feel like it was trying to escape his body. The sentry held formation practice the next morning despite catastrophic casualties. 43 men out of the original 80 were combat effective, meaning the Testudo would require integration with another equally depleted sentry or absorption of enough replacements to restore minimum functional numbers. The shield wall drill was surreal. Massive gaps where dead men should have stood, survivors shifting positions to maintain overlap, everyone moving with the mechanical precision that had been drilled into muscle memory, even as their minds processed the fact that half their friends were dead or dying. The debriefing revealed the disturbing truth about the Germanic chief in stolen armor. He was actually Marcus Valerius, a Roman centurion who deserted 8 months earlier after his entire century was annihilated in an ambush similar to yesterday's engagement. Valerius had apparently concluded that fighting for Rome was suicide, and fighting for the Germans offered better survival odds and personal autonomy. He'd spent months training Germanic warriors in Testudo counters, teaching them Roman tactics, and leading them in engagements specifically designed to neutralize formation advantages. His death in the marsh removed the immediate threat but established terrifying precedent. Roman soldiers were defecting and using their knowledge against their former comrades. The night brought dreams for the first time in weeks. Marcus's unconscious mind, apparently too traumatized by the day's events to maintain the protective emotional numbness. He dreamed of the marsh, but in the dream the mud was actually melted human flesh, warm and sticky and screaming when he stepped on it. The Germanic warriors had his face, all of them, thousands of versions of himself attacking from every direction, while the real Marcus tried to remember how to form Testudo with only his own body. He woke before dawn, covered in cold sweat despite the summer heat, his ruined foot throbbing in rhythm with his pulse. The sentry received 15 replacement legionaries that morning, fresh from training and psychologically unprepared for integration into a unit that had just suffered 40% casualties. The new men's youth and hope seemed obscene next to the survivors' traumatized silence. Decimus was assigned to mentor 3 of the replacements, teaching them the specific rhythms and responses that made their tent group functional. He performed the duty with mechanical competence, explaining shield overlap and gladius technique in flat monotone that suggested he was teaching procedures to equipment rather than people. Marcus watched the integration process from the medical tent where he remained under observation, while the maggots cleaned his wound. The new legionaries would either die in the next engagement or survive long enough to become emotionally deadened components like everyone else. There were no other trajectories. The Testudo demanded transformation from thinking, feeling human into reliable mechanical part. The alternative was death or desertion, and Valerius's corpse rotting in the marsh demonstrated that desertion just meant dying under different circumstances. The foot began healing after 2 weeks of maggot treatment and honey applications. The healing was incomplete and grotesque. Scar tissue replaced normal muscle, bones fused at wrong angles, the entire structure was permanently damaged. But Marcus could bear weight on it without collapsing, could march short distances with a pronounced limp, and could potentially maintain formation position if he didn't need to run or fight on difficult terrain. The medicus cleared him for light duty, which meant guard rotations and camp construction rather than frontline combat. The designation was temporary reprieve rather than permanent safety. The Legion's casualty rates meant everyone eventually rotated to combat, regardless of medical limitations. The Sentry reformed with its new members integrated and its casualties absorbed into the collective memory. They practiced formation drill daily, the Testudo taking shape despite the gaps where familiar faces should have been. The system worked because individual identity didn't matter. Marcus's position could be filled by any properly trained legionary. Quintus and Gaius and Flavius and the others were gone, but their functions continued in the shield wall. The formation was more important than the components. That was the Testudo's fundamental truth, the principle that made Roman military dominance possible. It was also the principle that made legionaries into expendable parts in a machine that would continue operating long after they were dead. The Legion's fifth major engagement occurred 9 weeks after the Marsh disaster, and Marcus fought in it despite the ruined foot that made every step a negotiation between necessity and agony. The Germanic coalition had reformed under new leadership, this time a tribal king named Ariogaesus, who'd studied Roman tactics not through desertion, but through 20 years of continuous warfare against frontier legions. His army numbered 32,000 warriors, the largest force assembled since the initial battle, and they'd learned from every previous defeat how to exploit Testudo weaknesses without abandoning the individual courage that made Germanic warriors formidable. The battlefield was open ground outside a Roman supply depot, terrain that favoured formations and should have guaranteed Roman victory through mathematical superiority. But Ariogaesus had developed a 3-phase assault doctrine specifically engineered to exhaust Testudo defences before the decisive engagement. Phase 1 involved massed archery from extreme range, not trying to kill Romans but forcing them to maintain overhead shields continuously, exhausting the men who carried that weight. Phase 2 deployed specialised assault groups with equipment designed to hook and pull Roman shields, creating gaps in the wall. Phase 3 committed the main force against a formation already weakened by fatigue and disruption. Marcus stood in the second rank during Phase 1, his ruined foot screaming protest as he maintained position through 2 hours of continuous arrow bombardment. The overhead shields deflected most projectiles, but the psychological pressure of constant impacts was designed to fray nerves and create anticipation fatigue where men became exhausted from tension rather than physical exertion. Several legionaries in the front rank were hit by arrows that found gaps in the overhead coverage, throat shots, facial wounds, arrows through eye sockets that killed instantly. The casualties were light numerically, but each death reinforced that the shield coverage wasn't perfect, and survival was probabilistic rather than guaranteed. The Germanic assault groups attacked during Phase 2 with equipment that demonstrated disturbing tactical sophistication. They carried long hooked poles, essentially naval boarding equipment adapted for land warfare, that could reach over the front rank and hook the overhead shields from above. Teams of 4 Germans would coordinate, 2 men with hooks to pull shields out of position, 2 men with spears to thrust through the created gaps. The tactic worked brilliantly against soldiers exhausted from maintaining overhead shields for hours. An entire section of the Testudo's left flank collapsed when 6 shields were simultaneously hooked and pulled, exposing the men beneath to spear thrusts that killed 11 legionaries before the formation could adapt. The Centurions responded by rotating tired overhead shield carriers to ground positions and elevating fresh men to replace them. The rotation broke formation cohesion temporarily, creating vulnerability that Germanic archers exploited with targeted volleys. Marcus rotated to front rank during this transition, his gladius immediately required as warriors surged forward to capitalize on the disrupted formation. The combat was vicious and compressed, Germans pushing against the shield wall with physical mass while Romans thrust through gaps with mechanical precision. Marcus killed 3 men in 90 seconds, each thrust finding vital organs through spaces between ribs that 6 months of practice had taught him to identify by feel rather than sight. Phase 3 began when the Germanic main force committed in a coordinated assault that hit the Testudo from 3 directions simultaneously. The flanking attacks forced the Roman formation to bend into a U-shape with both ends curving backward to prevent envelopment. The maneuver was textbook defensive response to multi-directional threat, but it stretched the shield wall thin and created internal pressures that made maintaining overlap difficult. Warriors pressed hardest against the formation's centre, trying to create a breakthrough that would split the Roman line and allow the flanking forces to collapse inward and destroy the legion piecemeal. The centre held through collective will that transcended individual capacity for endurance. Marcus found himself fighting in what had become the formation's critical point, the section absorbing maximum pressure from Germanic attacks that came in continuous waves without respite between assaults. His ruined foot finally gave out completely during the 3rd hour of sustained combat, bones grinding and ligaments tearing under stress they couldn't support. He fell backward into the man behind him, one of the new replacements named Tertius, creating exactly the gap Germanic tactics were designed to exploit. A warrior's axe descended toward the gap where Marcus had been standing, but Tertius was already moving forward to fill the position, his shield rising to block the axe while his gladius thrust upward into the attacker's groin in improvised counter that training hadn't covered. The replacement's instinctive response saved Marcus's life and prevented the gap from becoming catastrophic breach. Marcus crawled backward through the formation on hands and knees, useless foot dragging behind him, while combat continued overhead. He reached the formation's protected interior and discovered it was crowded with wounded men who'd been rotated out of direct combat, but remained within the Testudo's protective shell. The wounded section resembled Mobile Field Hospital, where Medici worked on casualties while the formation continued fighting around them. A legionary with an arrow through his shoulder sat next to a man trying to hold his intestines inside his opened abdomen. Another soldier was unconscious from head trauma, breathing but unresponsive, likely to die within hours from internal bleeding that battlefield medicine couldn't address. The medicus moved between patients with efficient triage, spending 30 seconds evaluating each wound before deciding whether treatment was possible or if mercy killing was the more humane option. Marcus's foot examination took 15 seconds. The medicus palpated the destroyed tissue, felt bones moving independently that should have been structurally connected, and delivered the verdict without emotion. The foot was permanently non-functional, and continuing to use it would cause damage that would spread up his leg and eventually require amputation at the knee. Marcus was combat ineffective and needed evacuation to the fortress for proper surgical intervention. The designation meant his war was over, at least temporarily. Whether he'd ever fight in Testudo formation again depended on surgeons and healing processes beyond his control. The Germanic assault finally broke against Roman discipline after 4 hours of sustained combat. Ariogeus's three-phase doctrine had worked brilliantly in theory, but failed the same way every Germanic strategy eventually failed. Individual warrior exhaustion couldn't match collective Roman sustainability. The formation had rotated tired fighters to rear positions and elevated fresh men to the front with mechanical efficiency that meant the Testudo never weakened despite continuous combat. Germanic warriors fought until they physically couldn't continue, then died or retreated. Romans fought in shifts, managing energy expenditure across the entire formation's depth. The casualties were the heaviest the legion had sustained in a single engagement: 473 dead and roughly 700 wounded out of 5,400 effective combatants. 22% casualties in one battle approached the threshold, where unit cohesion began degrading irreparably. But the Germanic losses were catastrophic. Estimated 12,000 dead scattered across the battlefield, Ariogeus himself killed by a pilum through the chest, and the tribal coalition shattered so completely that organised resistance would be impossible for months. Marcus watched the battlefield from a supply wagon during evacuation to the fortress. The dead stretched beyond visual range, the majority wearing Germanic clothing and displaying the distinctive wound patterns of gladius work. Concentrated stabbing trauma to torso and neck, minimal defensive injuries, death from blood loss or organ failure rather than immediate combat trauma. The mathematical efficiency of Testudo warfare was visible in the corpse distribution. Romans died scattered throughout where formation sections had been overwhelmed. Germans died in piles where they'd pressed against the shield wall and been systematically slaughtered. The victory celebration that night was muted despite the overwhelming tactical success. 22% casualties meant every surviving legionary had lost multiple tent mates, friends from training, men they'd fought beside for months. The collective grief was profound but couldn't be individually processed. The losses were too numerous, and the emotional bandwidth required to mourn each death properly would have caused complete psychological breakdown. Instead, the grief was compartmentalized, filed into mental spaces where it could be addressed later, maybe after the war ended, if they survived that long. The cremation pyres burned for 2 days, processing 473 bodies according to ritual that had become disturbingly routine. The Optio read names and service records, the priests performed abbreviated ceremonies, and the legion systematically converted corpses into ash and bone fragments that would be stored in urns until transport back to family burial sites became possible. Marcus listened to the names from his hospital cot, recognizing voices belonging to men he'd trained with, fought beside, shared meals and guard duty, and the grinding terror of waiting for battle. Each name was a person reduced to memory, a gap in the formation that would be filled by a replacement who'd die and be replaced in turn. The surgical intervention on Marcus's foot occurred 3 days after the battle. The legion's chief medicus performed the procedure using techniques refined through centuries of battlefield medicine: cauterization to prevent bleeding, wine as antiseptic despite its limited effectiveness, and manual manipulation of bone fragments into approximate anatomical positions. The surgery was performed without anesthesia because effective pain management didn't exist beyond alcohol and opium derivatives that were reserved for amputations. Marcus experienced every moment of bone setting and tissue cauterization with full consciousness, his screams joining those of other surgical patients in creating ambient horror that made the hospital tent sound like torture chamber. The foot healed wrong despite the surgical intervention. The bones fused at angles that made normal walking impossible and running completely out of the question. The permanent limp meant Marcus would never again fight in Testudo formation, where maintaining exact position and movement synchronization was mandatory. His military career was functionally over after 9 months of service, his body broken before he'd completed even 5% of the standard 25-year enlistment. The Legion would discharge him with minimal pension, enough to survive poverty-stricken, but not enough to reclaim the life he had abandoned when volunteering. The replacements arrived in continuous stream throughout the following weeks, fresh legionaries cycling through training and immediately deployed to fill gaps in formations that had been depleted by casualties. The new soldiers were younger each month as recruitment standards relaxed to meet demand. Boys of 17 and 16 pressed into service, their bodies not fully developed, their psychological readiness non-existent. They would die faster than earlier cohorts, the attrition rate accelerating as the Legion accepted increasingly marginal recruits to maintain minimum operational strength. Marcus watched the training drills from the hospital area, where recovering wounded were segregated from healthy soldiers. The new recruits practiced shield wall formation with the same mechanical repetition he'd endured, learned the same thrust and withdraw gladius technique, underwent the same brutal conditioning that transformed civilians into components. Some would survive long enough to become effective fighters. Most would die in their first or second engagement, killed before the transformation completed, their bodies cremated and their names read at ceremonies that had become so routine nobody really listened anymore. The psychological damage became undeniable during Marcus's recovery period. He experienced nightmares every night despite exhaustion that should have produced dreamless sleep. The dreams featured Testudo formations that collapsed repeatedly, shield walls breaking and reforming in endless loops, while Germanic warriors poured through gaps that couldn't be closed. He would wake screaming, disturbing the other wounded men, unable to explain that the nightmares were worse than the actual combat, because in dreams there was no collective discipline to dilute individual terror. The other recovering wounded showed similar psychological fractures. A legionary named Aulus would suddenly start crying for no apparent reason, tears streaming down his face while he continued whatever task he'd been performing. Another soldier named Macro had stopped speaking entirely, responding to questions with gestures and maintaining silence even during medical examinations. The psychological casualties were as numerous as physical injuries, but received zero treatment because the concept of mental trauma as legitimate medical condition didn't exist in Roman military doctrine. Broken minds were considered moral failures, evidence of insufficient courage rather than legitimate wounds requiring care. The discharge papers arrived 6 weeks after the final battle. Marcus was classified as medically unfit for continued service, released from military obligation, and granted pension of 40 denarii annually, barely enough to rent a room and buy food, completely insufficient for anything approaching comfortable existence. The pension would be paid irregularly and could be cancelled administratively if any bureaucrat decided Marcus's injuries didn't warrant continued support. Thousands of discharged veterans survived in brutal poverty throughout the empire, their service rewarded with just enough money to prevent outright starvation, but not enough to live with dignity. Marcus packed his personal belongings, the bronze Mars figurine from his mother, a letter from his father written just before the old man died, and the military discharge certificate that proved his service. Everything else had been issued by the Legion and needed to be returned. Armour, weapons, tools, even the personal items that had accumulated through months of service. Leaving meant shedding military identity entirely and attempting to reconstruct civilian personality from whatever psychological fragments remained after 9 months of systematic dehumanization. The Legion continued its operations without acknowledging Marcus's departure. Fresh replacements had already filled his position in the formation, the shield wall maintaining its integrity regardless of individual component changes. The Testudo would continue functioning long after every current legionary was dead, replaced by new recruits who'd be similarly processed through training and combat until they died, or were discharged, or completed their enlistments and tried to return to civilian lives their military service had made impossible. The frontier fortress receded behind Marcus as he walked south towards civilization, his permanent limp making progress slow and painful. The Danube campaign would continue for years, possibly decades, consuming legionaries in mathematically predictable quantities as Rome extended its borders incrementally northward. The Testudo's tactical superiority meant Rome would eventually win, but victory would be measured in body count ratios favourable enough to make the strategic objectives worthwhile. Individual soldiers were expendable components whose deaths mattered only insofar as they affected the formation's operational capacity. Marcus understood the Testudo completely now, in ways that training couldn't convey. The formation worked because it eliminated individual agency, distributed psychological burden across collective mass, and converted human beings into reliable mechanical components through systematic conditioning that broke personality and rebuilt it around tactical doctrine. The cost was measured in destroyed bodies, shattered minds, and lives that would never recover from the transformation even if they physically survived. The Testudo wasn't just military tactics, it was a philosophical system that subordinated human value to collective effectiveness, and made that subordination seem not just acceptable, but noble. The knowledge was useless for civilian reintegration. Marcus would spend the rest of his life unable to function in contexts that required individual decision-making and emotional engagement. The formation had taught him to trust the system, follow orders, and believe that collective discipline was more important than personal survival. Those lessons were catastrophically maladaptive outside military structure. He would struggle with employment, relationships, and basic social interaction, because 9 months in the Testudo had fundamentally rewired how his brain processed reality and relationships. The sun set over unfamiliar landscape as Marcus made camp for his first night as civilian. He'd survived the Germanic campaigns when statistics suggested he should have died. The survival felt hollow rather than triumphant because the person who'd volunteered 9 months ago was effectively dead, replaced by psychological shell that could form Testudo and kill efficiently, but couldn't remember how to exist as individual human being. The Testudo had consumed him as thoroughly as it consumed all its components. The only difference was his body had been ejected from the machine before it was physically destroyed. His mind had been ground down and rebuilt according to tactical requirements that civilian life had no use for. He was alive, functionally, but the life ahead would be haunted by the knowledge of what he'd become and what that transformation had cost in ways that couldn't be measured or repaired.